All right, so you've chosen to go wandering with Walt Whitman, the American bard. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Uh, we'll I'll give you some things to think about, to ponder, uh, and some background and contextual information that I hope will help you as you're reading from Leaves of Grass, Whitman's Song of Myself. So, here's his life at a glance. I'm not going to read each of the slides, or each of the bullet points, but I'll embellish sort of what's happening there. He was born 30 years after George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the newly formed United States. He was born into a working class family. You can see where he grew up and where he lived. His father was a carpenter and farmer who was 34 years old when Whitman was born. He mainly lived on the East Coast. He did, however, take a very influential trip to New Orleans, where it's believed that he had a male lover, as expressed in the original manuscript of Once I Passed Through a Populous City. He's considered to be a queer writer, and you can see when he died, with Horace Logo Trebell, an American journalist and socialist, at his deathbed. So, Whitman's world, I think it's important for us to have a little bit of grounding in what was happening while Whitman was alive and writing. He's a part of the first generation of Americans who were born into the newly formed United States and grew up assuming the considered to be stable existence of the new country. At this time, there was an immense pride that was emerging, and there was also a lot of nationalist pride. And you can see that quite a bit in Whitman's work. And I think it's interesting to consider, if we are to put ourselves in the shoes of people living at that time, creating what they consider to be a new idealistic sort of community. The documents upon which the government and the country are founded are supposed to be idealistic. But I think that it would be remiss of us to see that the idealism and the ideals that are presented in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, things of that nature, weren't being lived up to practically for everyone in America or in the United States, right? So there's still a real disconnect between the two. And that leads us to the institution of slavery and the fact that there were many people who were enslaved during this time. And as we've discussed in class, Whitman's views on the institution of slavery were considered to be inconsistent and self-contradictory. In fact, despite his seeming opposition of slavery, which many critics see as evidenced in Leaves of Grass, through his inclusion of African Americans in his visions of what critics Folsom and Price term as, quote, an ideal multiracial republic, and as he portrays them being the African Americans as beautiful, dignified, and intelligent, there is ample evidence, end quote, there is ample evidence from his other writing and editorials that Whitman was incredibly racist. And so again, that concept of what is the ideal, what is the how do we want to transcend as a people, as a culture? What would be the more perfected way of being? And then what is actually happening? This brings us to the concept of abolition and abolitionism. So various Whitman texts show that he had little tolerance for abolitionism. and that he thought black people were inferior to white people, and that his opposition to the extension of slavery, he thought slavery should be abolished, but his perspective on why it should be abolished had little, if anything, to do with sympathy for the enslaved people. And so when we were reading the article about reading while white, we can also think about what it is to write while white, particularly during this period, and the biases and the perspectives. And so as you're reading Song of Myself, look closely and critically at those sections where Whitman is speaking about people of color and enslaved people, and think, is he perpetuating commonly held views of racism and prejudice, or is he presenting an more idealistic ideal that we as humanity can strive to achieve? Or is it something in between? The daguerreotype was developed. It's the first effective method of photography, and the first picture was taken in 1826 to 1827. The reason I bring this up is because Whitman loved having his photo taken, so we'll have a lot of pictures to look at in a bit. And the Civil War, which deals with, obviously, the institution of slavery, the abolitionist movement, took place in 1861 to 1865. Whitman was a very versatile human being who did a lot of different things throughout his life. I'm not going to go into every single one of these because there's so much to share about who he was and what he did. I think it's really significant to note that his formal education ended at 11 years old. He was self-educated thereafter, working for lawyers in Brooklyn who gave him a subscription to a circulating library. He used a lot of public resources, visited museums, was a voracious reader, and he read so much that people thought he was lazy because they thought it was just a leisurely thing. But for him, it was to grow in knowledge and understanding. He often engaged people in conversation and debate. At 12 years old, he worked in the printing office of a newspaper. He was influenced by a number of romantic novels that he read, fascinated by Sir Walter Scott's novels, and Whitman contributed small sentimental pieces to the newspapers for which he worked. As a novice journalist in his mid-teens, Whitman began contributing pieces, probably correct, conventional poems, to one of the best Manhattan papers called The Mirror. As a school teacher, it was an unlikely career choice for him. It kept him at 17 from acquiescing to becoming a farmer at his father's urgings. He taught for 5 years from 1836 to 41. He writes about it being some of his most unhappy years. He taught in at least 10 different Long Island towns and missed the city life. There's not much information about his teaching techniques, but from short recollections of former students, Whitman was progressive in this aspect of his life. He encouraged students to think aloud instead of simply regurgitating information. He wouldn't engage in corporal punishment. He wouldn't paddle misbehaving students like most people did. He incorporated educational games, and he used his own poems, though not examples of his progressive poetry, to come as texts. He was also a fiction writer. Between the years of 1841 to 48, he published approximately 24 short stories and vignettes in news and literary papers. He included edited versions in Specimen Days and Collect. His stories reflect the mass market reading taste in the America of Whitman's youth. Their relation to his later work has recently become a question of critical interest with scholars. He was a hopeful politician. At the age of 21, he began speaking at Democratic rallies in Manhattan. He was always a Democrat politically, which relates to Jacksonian democracy. And even though his editorials would sometimes sound more conservative, and he sympathized with the free soldiers, those who opposed the spread of slavery into new territories acquired by the U.S. in sympathy. He was a mature journalist in 1842 and 43. He moved in and out of positions, which was common for journalists at the time, and he worked on an array of newspapers, including the Aurora, the Evening Tatler, the Statesman, and Sunday Times. He wrote on topics ranging from criticizing how the police rounded up prostitutes to denouncing Bishop John Hughes for his effort to use public funds to support parochial schools. He was an opera lover. This is significant because Italian opera and opera singers were an important influence on Whitman's creative development during these crucial years in the early 1850s when Leaves of Grass was germinating. There's probably no other singular influence more important than this one when we consider how many poems Whitman calls songs or chants and how many references he makes to the voice and to singing. We come to see that music and singing were central to the creation of his poetry. Whitman once declared, "But for the emotions, raptures, uplifts of opera, I could never have written Leaves of Grass." So think about that as you're reading and hearing Leaves of Grass. What's interesting too is he was a carpenter. He was a house builder. He gave up newspaper work for carpentry between 1851 to 54. And then he was a poet. After leaving the carpentry trade, he dedicated himself to writing. And he stayed true to his art and ideas. He was determined to overcome censorship, and he would not apologize for his work or early work. And he made he attempted to remain faithful to what he called, quote, the good old cause of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I'm curious to see if you believe that he did remain faithful to that. He was considered a humanitarian during the Civil War. He volunteered his services as hospital attendant, taking the role of wound dresser. He paid visits to prisoners and regularly visited sick stage drivers. And he wrote a series of war poems that reflect what he sort of gained from that time. He also gained an intense admiration for Abraham Lincoln, and you can hear about more about the tragedies of war and Lincoln's assassination that inspired Whitman's "Oh, Captain, My Captain," which you might recall from Dead Poets Society. Robin Williams does a really beautiful rendition there. And then "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." When we look at Leaves of Grass, I said I wasn't going to talk about them all, but then I decided to go ahead and do it. So I hope you found it interesting. So before we get to, here's Whitman between 1848 and 1854, and he describes himself: "We took our cane, a heavy, dark, beautifully polished, hook-ended one, and our hat, a plain, neat, fashionable one from Banta's 130 Chatham Street, which he got gratis on the on the strength of giving him this puff, and sauntered forth." So you can just see sort of a little glimpse into kind of his personality, who he was, especially when he was young. Leaves of Grass, which includes the Song of Myself, is his claim to fame. He wrote it when he was in his 30s, 34 when he started it, 36 when he published it. There's some controversy. Some say he was 31. I want you to think about, there's a persona, there's a narrator. Again, we talk about this in class, that we want to separate the narrator, the persona, the speaker from the author. Even though this is a song of myself and there is an I, It's a persona that's created, and it's an idealized persona. So Whitman uses this persona who's an idealized version of the American working classman. And so keep that in mind as you're reading it. It's also good to see that this one large poem is actually comprised of a large number of smaller poems. So it's often what you'll find is people will pull out different poems from this one large poem, Leaves of Grass. There is some controversy as to whether the poems should be numbered or not, as they should be really read as one continuous work. But most editors break the poem into sections. And critics argue whether it should be as few as 7 sections or as many as 10 sections. The first edition of Leaves of Grass was placed on sale on July 4th, 1855, and it does not bear much resemblance to any of the later editions that grew larger as Whitman added new poems. So this is a work that over time Whitman revisited and continued to revise and edit and add to and take away from. And so each edition can be very different, and if you want to get into more scholarly work about it, it's pretty fascinating to see the differences and what gets omitted, what gets added, when, and what that might lend to a deeper understanding. Another first is that Whitman worked to publish this work himself, which he was one of the first authors to seek to publish their own, be self-published in that way. When you're thinking about the subsequent editions that he had published, he had the 5th edition in 1871. There's another edition called the Deathbed Edition because in 1891 to 92, it was actually a reissue of the 1881 edition with a few extra poems included. And that was considered to be put together before he died. So here's another picture of Whitman, perhaps in 1871. And I think it's interesting to see sort of when you have such a famous author, and if they are keeping journals and you can sort of track their personal growth along with their artistic growth, I think there's something special about that. So hopefully you've read this while I've been talking. You can sort of see what he's saying about this picture and about who he is. Here he is in the late 1800s, and he makes notes about this portrait as well. And so you can sort of see his own self-criticisms, his own sort of perspective and point of view in there as well. With his friends and contemporary, they kind of, throughout his life, Whitman seemed to have 2 distinct groups of friends that he never really let commingle. So one would be the working class fellow, which included deckhands on ferries, stage drivers of horse-pulled buses. He would be friends with working class folks, and he would hang out with them. Then he also had this other group, the cultured folks, who included literary, publishing, and theatrical folks. And some of the literary folks include Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a few of the Transcendentalists, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Amos Bronson Alcott, who is Louisa May Alcott's father. And here's another image where you can see this is the first extant photo of Whitman with anyone else. And here is Peter Doyle, Whitman's close friend and companion in Washington. And some think that they were lovers. And so you can read that quotation and everything there. And when we think about his personality, we kind of can see his personality reflected in the different images and also what he says about himself. So as he moves through several phases in his life, 3 of them are identified with the following titles: the illuminated Whitman, the bohemian inflated Whitman, and the good gray poet Whitman. So let's look at, this is sort of the picture of the illuminated Whitman, which Richard Maurice Buck called Whitman's Christ likeness. So it's thought that Whitman's view of God as an abstract principle of energy that is manifested in every living creature as well as in nature is sort of at the heart of how he writes about God during this time. In addition, according to Whitman, God is an absolute, unchanging, all-enfolding consciousness, a divine ground from which all things emanate, and then to which all things hope to return. So he's also thought of as being more mystic, a prophet, and he would even call himself a self-proclaimed God-inspired prophet. It's interesting to note that upon writing, in particular, Song of Myself, that Whitman had been granted a direct vision of truth and ecstasy and experience that helped him gain knowledge of the self, which he then expressed in this poem. This gained him the name of seer, which contributed to this sort of persona of the illuminated Whitman. It's also intriguing that even though he was uneducated in Eastern philosophy, his works express many Eastern tenets, with karma and different things like that. With the bohemian and more inflated Whitman, we see that he's kind of feeling himself a little bit. And in 1857, around that time until this time, he allowed his pride to swell. He felt that he was a prophet of self and wanted to create a new religion with the leaves of grass as its basis and main text. Ultimately, he became afflicted with megalomania, a mental disorder characterized by delusions of grandeur, which threw him out of touch with the human possibilities of American life that he once knew so intimately and so clearly expressed in his poetry. At this time, when Henry David Thoreau visited Whitman, he noticed that Whitman's bed was unmade and that an unemptied chamber pot stood beneath it, that he was maybe getting a little too big for his britches or kind of losing touch with reality. It is thought that during this time Whitman was a predecessor of the beatniks. He wore a beard, untrimmed hair, dressed in the equivalent of a sweater and sandals, but also his writing, we'll see later, was very influential on the many beat writers. But he also his conduct resembled that of the Beat generation. He stayed out of, quote, the rat race. He avoided squares. He was far out. He was considered sort of counterculture to the popular culture of the time. He wrote poems in the open, free-swinging style that is prized in Beat generation literature. We'll talk more about this breath line that Whitman employs in a little bit. And ultimately, he broke the rules of 19th century's elegant writing style to create a new writing style that opens up the doors for lots of other writing style. And then as the good, great poet Whitman, this is when he kind of gets over himself, so to speak. He finds his humility, he finds his place in the world, and this is when he engages in his unselfish service in the army hospitals, helped to establish this more wise, good, great poet persona. This is the personality that stays with Whitman until the end of his life, and it was during the post-war years as the good gray poet that Whitman was considered to have produced some of his most important work. And then his work shifts back to Eastern beliefs expressed in the Song of Myself as well. In terms of criticism, after Leaves of Grass was published, Whitman wrote 3 positive reviews. This was the majority of the positive reviews of his own work. So that also shows you sort of his inflated sense of self, but also his strong self-esteem. Whitman was fired from his position at the Department of the Interior after the new secretary had read and discovered the sexual and particularly the homosexual aspects of Whitman's work, and he received a lot of censorship for that. In fact, there was a lawsuit threatened against his work because of the sexually explicit and the homosexual, homoerotic images, that it was considered to be indecent. But it's important to note that when we're thinking about queer theory and queer people's space in society at this time, this is incredibly revolutionary for Whitman to not only so straightforwardly present the LGBTQ plus, particularly gay males, experience, but to do it so unapologetically, and to show the beauty in different types of identities, different types of sexual orientation, and different types of love. The public view, Walt Whitman is considered by many to be one of America's most influential and innovative poets. Some believe that he speaks for all Americans and for all of humanity, but we also see that increasingly scholars are facing and dealing with the fact that he has not been actively speaking for everyone, and that he has spoken actively against some folks, particularly our Black brothers and sisters. In terms of transcendent, Whitman has commonly been perceived as one of the few white American writers who transcends some of the prevailing views of his time to try to embody egalitarian ideals. He's been adopted as a poetic father by poets of Indigenous American, Asian, African, European, Chicano descent, Chicanx descent. But nonetheless, the truth is that Whitman in person largely, though confusedly and idiosyncratically, internalized typical white racial attitudes of his time, place, and class, and those racist attitudes, right? And we have this mixed celebration. Recent critics decry Whitman's shortcoming and failures to live up to his own finest ideals, and some people of color and writers of color, from Langston Hughes to June Jordan to Yusef Komunyakaa, have, with rare exceptions, warmed to an outlook extraordinary for its sympathy, generosity, and capaciousness. So it's a mixed bag, as we're seeing, with how Whitman is viewed. So Whitman was nursed in his final illness by Frederick Warren Fritzinger. Worry, a former sailor, Whitman liked Worry's touch, which blended masculine strength and feminine tenderness. Although there was some speculation of the cause of Whitman's decline, the autopsy showed Whitman to be free of alcoholism or syphilis. Daniel Longacre, Whitman's physician, emphatically rejected the, quote, slanderous accusations that debauchery and excess of various kinds caused or contributed to Whitman's breakdown, end quote. And then the cause of death was ultimately determined miliary tuberculosis, with other contributing factors. The autopsy revealed that one lung had completely collapsed and the other was working only at 1/8 capacity. His heart was surrounded by a large number of small abscesses and about 2 half quarts of water. When we think about Whitman's influence, he brought on a literary revolution as he evolved poetry into the language of the common person. His free verse, notice it's a free verse. It's not formal in any way. There's not this formal stanza, rhyme and meter, all of those things. But he developed what's termed the breath line, a line of poetry approximating what a person could utter in a single breath. Whitman once said that his book and the war are one when he was talking about his Leaves of Grass and the Civil War. He's been seen as people have talked back to him, right? Seeing that in some ways, in the idealistic way, he's aspiring to inclusivity. But as we've read about and as we've discussed, different writers of color and other minority writers and white writers alike are talking back to Whitman to see about how to extend, refine, rewrite, battle, endorse, and reject the work of this writer who strove and who was a part of helping to create this national identity and poetic language. Over a couple centuries after his death, Whitman is a vital presence in American cultural memory. Television shows depict him, musicians allude to him, schools and bridges are named after him, truck stops, apartment complex, parks, think tanks, summer camps, corporate centers, and shopping malls all bear his name. I have a couple poems here that you can take a look at also to kind of enter into Whitman. And then here's what he has to say. Those are pictures of his writing. Here's what he has to say about America. And the thing that I think is it's countless living equal men. Unfortunately, we're going to see men as being human, but it would have been a little bit more male focused at the time, but average free. Notice that common working class person, not rich folk, a celebration of that. There was an interesting advertising campaign that Levi's did where they used Whitman, and you can hear Whitman's voice reading the poem. And it's interesting to watch the commercial because in the commercial there's more people of diversity, and I'm wondering if you might think that in that representation that Whitman's ideal about inclusivity and about transcending racism and seeing everyone as equal humans is sort of celebrated and depicted in that commercial. So that was the original America that he wrote, and this is the published America that came later, and this is the poem that's in the commercial. And then here you go. This is Whitman's absorption by all people from all walks of life justifies his bold claim of 1855 that the proof of a poet is that his country absorbs him as affectionately as he has absorbed it. So I leave that to you to decide. Do you think that he's worthy of absorption? His words are worthy of absorption? Do you believe that he affectionately absorbed the country, which included all of the people living in it at the time? So there we are. Thank